Well, hey there. Long time no see, nerds. And literally first time see, in fact. I apologize that I don't have a sick-ass background for you yet. I'll figure that out somehow, someday. Somehow, some way. Brain fart. Okay, so it's been a minute, as I was saying. I have not created a podcast in quite some time. I put this one together, it was ready to record before the solstice, before December 21st. It was all ready, all written, typey-tapped out, and all that, all the research done. But then I got sicker than shit, and I have remained sicker than shit for months now. It is now January 18th, so I've been sick for November, December. I've been sick for 3 months. I'd have a few days here and there where I was functional, but I was always very busy on those days. There were holidays and such occurring on those days. I'm lucky I was able to do what I did do in all this time. Anyway, that's my long-winded and probably very unnecessary explanation for why it's been so long since I've uploaded again. I have another episode in the works already that's going to be a really fun one where I will have a co-host or a guest or whatever you would like to call it, and that should be uploaded relatively soon, within the next month. That'll be really fun. I'm going to be talking with my cousin Holly, who is my best friend for my entire life forever, and also she does divination. She's got a small tarot reading business, and she's awesome, and we're going to talk about spooky stuff together. It's unscripted, it'll just be us bullshitting, but we're both hilarious, and if you like me, you'll like her. She's a lot more positive than I feel like I don't come off as the most excited or positive person, and she is like a ray of sunshine, so she's like me if I liked the sun, you know what I'm saying? Anyway, that should be fun for everyone whenever that's all edited and put up and what have you. I feel like personal news. I moved. I live in this house now, if you didn't guess. I've also started streaming on Twitch. I haven't done it in a few days. I got a big sick over the weekend. But, yeah, the name on Twitch is BackAlley Alchemist. I don't really do anything particular. I play Overwatch a lot. I have Pokemon Red that I'm playing through. And I have a ROM for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and one for Legend of Dragoon. Legend of Dragoon is going to be a lot of fun. That's my favorite game ever. But if you want to support me on that also, Twitch TV, BackAlley Alchemist. I might eventually integrate some of the folklore stuff, and if I'm playing a boring game that doesn't require a lot of attention, I could talk about basically whatever. That would be a good forum if someone wanted to go on and just ask me questions and make me answer live and with my face. That would be fun. Anyway, this episode I wanted to release in the dead of winter. I guess January. If you're anywhere but Western Washington, January's still the dead of winter, right? It's supposed to be. I wanted to release it on the solstice because it's about the cold and the dark and the way that the cold and the dark just totally fucks with us as people. And I've never recorded while I was recording. I've never video recorded while I was recording the podcast before. So let me know if where my eyes are is stupid. I write my podcast scripts kind of like they're a research paper. So it's kind of wordy, and I'm throw in my natural add-ons or what I have to say as I go along, but it's a lot of reading. So if I'm looking down the whole time, if that's annoying when you watch the video, let me know, and I'll see if I can put that shit higher up or closer to the camera or something so it's better in the future. This is a practice go, essentially. So, here we are. This one, originally I was going to specifically do crime and madness in Antarctica. So I lovingly named the notes McMurder Station, which I find hilarious, because McMurdo Station in Antarctica, but it ended up being about a lot more than that. So I'm going to shut the fuck up, and we'll get into that business now. Also, Gengar hoodie. All day. All day Gengar. Okay, so it starts off with a tale, like many episodes do. I sat in our shelter, fashioned together with branches we had gathered from around the small clearing on the cliffside. The snow was deep, and I'd lost feeling in my feet hours earlier. The friends I was traveling with were working to get a fire started as I wrapped myself tightly in the wool and fleece, wondering if I'd ever be able to wiggle my toes again. It was pretty brutal, if I'm being quite frank. The idea was simple, and it started out with the same youthful exuberance that has birthed many of my travels. It was the middle of wintertime, and the little coastal area where I lived still hadn't gotten any snow. As one who loves nothing more than a frozen wasteland, this struck me as unacceptable. If the snow wouldn't come to me, then I guess I must go to the snow. It makes sense, right? Somehow, I convinced 2 of my friends to go find the snow with me. We had a small sleepover. We had a small sleepover at one of their houses, and his wife made us homemade bread for the journey. We mapped out the terrain and set a plan for the path we would take. We had everything meticulously calculated, really. We each had a small survival pack in our bags, warm clothing, good sleeping bags. We'd done a lot of survival training in the past, so we were very confident. We told everyone important the coordinates of the gate we would be passing, and the coordinates of our intended destination, and we set off at around dawn to make sure we had plenty of time to get up the mountain and set up our camp. The car didn't make it far past the snow line, as cars often don't, so we gathered our gear and started hoofing up the Olympic foothill, following a dirt road cloaked in ice. I had unfortunately packed my bag poorly, so the way the weight was distributed was causing it to strain my shoulders and pull me down toward the back. I put all of the heavy stuff at the bottom, like an idiot. I learned not to do this when I was traveling. If you put all of the heavy stuff on the bottom, it's going to, pull you down that way. And so you should put heavy stuff on top, so it's higher up and easier for your back. Anyway, I did not do this. I did it the dumb way. Which wouldn't have been so bad if we weren't climbing elevation steadily through deep snow. When I began to feel moisture inside of my boots, I knew it would be a real problem if we didn't get to camp soon. Luckily, we got there before my feet were totally numb. However, we still had to build our shelter and get a fire started. Building the shelter was relatively simple. You dig out the snow from an area large enough for the 3 of us, collect as many sturdy branches as possible to create a little triangle of sorts, then layer as much foliage and green boughs as possible over the top, then lay a tarp across the ground inside, then cover that, furthermore, with branches and foliage to keep ourselves off of the ground. While it wasn't a complicated process, it took what seemed like forever in the cold. By the time it was finished, I couldn't feel my feet or my hands at all. In this case, I was the youngest and the smallest, and honestly the weakest link physically. So my buddies helped bundle me up and insisted that I stay inside the shelter while they got a fire going. This is when the sun went down. As the sun dropped behind the ridge to the west, so dropped the temperature. Fuck your Avast One celebration. Eat a dick, Avast. I used to love you. Wait, sorry. Oh, yeah, okay. I couldn't get my feet to warm up, despite them being dry. I hope that's where I was. I finally got them dry, but they wouldn't warm up. The cold was soaked into my bones, and my circulation just wasn't pumping enough to get warm blood down there to my toesies, so they just stayed numb. It was miserable. And my friends fought with wet branches for hours without a single spark that lasted. One went off to look for a rotten stump, hoping some pitch would be inside. He could only bring back a small amount, and it wasn't enough to get a flame. The problem was that we were in the Olympic Mountains, the Pacific Northwest, where it's famously wet all year round, so these trees were well hydrated. Even on branches that would otherwise be dry from resting on the ground for months were soaked through from the rain and snow. As the hours crept on and on, I still couldn't warm up. I began to feel something welling inside of me, a sort of panic that I had never experienced before. We were completely helpless up here if we couldn't start a fire. We had firearms. People knew our general location. Fuck. We had food. So as long as frostbite didn't get us, we would have been fine in all honesty, but it didn't feel that way. This was long before the time of smartphones. Maybe some people had them back then, but none of us did. I believe I still had a little prepaid brick phone at the time, actually. If I had any phone at all. Even if we had cell service in those woods, we couldn't have gotten a hold of anyone for help. Something about the silence in those mountains, as if all sound is dulled by the snow. It seems so empty, like the only thing out there would be something that was going to hurt me. The canyon we were camped overlooking stretched out into nothingness, especially in the dark. That void of darkness and a frozen world that you cannot see instills in one a pervasive and non-specific fear. You feel so small and more fragile than the ice that snaps and falls from the tree down the hill. It's almost as if there's no life left anywhere around you. Eventually we abandoned our camp, threw everything onto our tarp, and trudged those couple of miles back down the mountainside, hauling our belongings on our makeshift sled. We made it back to the car and drank some whiskey while we warmed ourselves up with the heater. Operation Fail. That was the first time in my life that I felt the maw of true fear, that innate panic that comes when you feel completely helpless. Needless to say, I fucking loved it, and I have gone on to continue nearly dying on frozen mountains almost every year since. I just get better at it every time. I could tell you about the time we had to ditch all of our supplies in the hopes of making it to a cabin and had to melt snow for water. Or that one time we got chased out by a pack of wolves. Coincidentally, all three of these stories, or with one of them, is the same person. But I say, as with anything else, nothing ever feels as pure and true as that first time you do it. Similar to addiction in that way, I suppose. Oh shit. Am I addicted to almost dying? At least it's not meth, mother. God damn it. Well, while my experience in the darkness and bitter cold turned out well, and it was brief and largely controlled, it's a simple example of something very real that happens to us in environments of cold and isolation. Jack London has written many stories exploring the way these things mess with our heads, and yes, I think he was a pedo. So that sucks. He could write an adventure story like no one's business, though. And I really liked The Call of the Wild. Better yet, though, one of my favorite tales of all time, Frankenstein, which is a big surprise to everyone, I'm sure, is framed in the Arctic. Mary Shelley's fine ass wrote Frankenstein in 1818 when the fervor for Arctic exploration was at its height. Shelley saw the way that the Arctic, even the idea of it, captured people's imaginations and their hubris in a way rarely seen before. Frankenstein is a story about mankind's obsession with power and our capacity for, well, thinking our shit don't stink. And seriously fucking up because of that. In this way, the exploration of the Arctic corresponds perfectly with the theme of the classic horror story. One of the main characters at the beginning is Captain Robert Walton, and he consistently writes stories to his beloved sister in which he describes his excitement surrounding his adventure into uncharted territories. I shall Man, I was gonna try to act. I'm gonna do it again. I shall satiate my ardent curiosity with the sight of a part of the world never before visited, and may tread a land never before imprinted by the foot of man. Did I do good? I know I did good. I don't need your validation. As his expedition in the north goes on, our captain starts to fall victim to that overwhelming sense of isolation and loss of power that is later reflected in the experiences of Frankenstein's creation. In the story, the barren and desolate landscape of the Arctic Sea is a physical representation of that emptiness that permeates within him, and all that exists aside from that never-ending nothing are jagged clumps of ice that threaten to destroy his ship, and a bitter cold that bites his face and hands, a perfect metaphor for not just disappointment when we find that we are less capable than we thought, and less powerful than we think, but the way that we are without any comforts or support. The world itself becomes our predator. Does that make sense? Did I say that right? I'm all jumbled up in the noggin. I've got the post-eternal sickness brain fog. I'm sure you understand. And while in this story the Arctic acts as a metaphor for cruelty and disillusionment, the reality is that these frozen, violent environments truly do have this effect on us as human beings. And funny enough, not funny ha-ha, but funny ah. We see this sort of misery and suffering, both physical and psychological, in real-life expeditions into the Arctic or Antarctic regions of this wretched Earth. The nastiest of these that I could find, without going over events that other content creators have covered to death, is the case of the Belgica. The Belgica. Wow, what timing. A 3-masted whale ship that set off into the uncharted waters of Antarctica in 1897. This was a Belgian scientific mission to collect data about mysterious frozen regions south of mankind's charted world. 7 months into the mission, the Belgica was caught in a pack of sea ice and was stuck in place throughout the entirety of the 6-month Antarctic winter. These were the first people to ever have to endure the Antarctic winter in history, and oh boy, it did not go well. Even when the sun came back in July, it wasn't warm enough to loosen the ice that held the ship captive, and the distress among the crew only continued to worsen. In early August, a deckhand was awakened with the rest of the crew in the morning, but was completely non-responsive. After the ship's doctor looked him over, he concluded that, physically, the lad was perfectly fine. Whatever was causing this anatonic state was psychological. The crew had to take turns watching over him as they waited for him to speak again. He had gone completely silent, acted as though he couldn't hear anyone talking to him, let alone comprehend what was being said. He didn't speak, he didn't move. He was like a fleshy stone. He was like a stone man. It only took about a week for him to begin responding and speaking again, but when he finally started to use his voice, what he said was fucking weird. Among the first things that came out of his mouth was a declaration that he would kill the chief engineer on board. For no apparent reason. He just kinda decided that. He was deep in an episode of Psychosis, and this episode terrified the fuck out of all of his shipmates, who were already having a real bad time. They began to watch him with fear rather than concern, not only because he had described intent to kill people on board, but because it showed to them that they were in danger of ending up in the same state he was. But he wasn't the only one who went insane on board. A seasoned and greatly experienced bosun started to lose it shortly after the deckhand did. He started to become incredibly paranoid. He thought that his shipmates were plotting to murder him, and he insisted on sleeping in the main hold rather than the forecastle, where everyone else slept. He found a mound of snow on deck that was sorta shaped like a mailbox, and he constantly wrote letters to the woman he loved back home named Agnes, and he placed them in the mound of snow. God, poor guy. His letters were full of ramblings about how his shipmates were plotting against him and how he was going to kill the first mate, with whom he had actually been homies. He would go to the mailbox, smile, and say that the letters were on their way to Agnes. Despite being an incredibly skilled and motivated mariner, he was no longer capable of doing much of anything. They couldn't get him to work. They could get him to strip sealskins. But he would just do that for about 10 minutes, then stare blankly into the distance for the rest of the day. you know? One of those. He was another terrifying reminder to the rest of the crew that their sanity was on the chopping block as well. If the madmen on the boat didn't kill them, and the cold didn't kill them, who's to say they wouldn't go mad and kill themselves? The surgeon on board wrote, I get to act again. Here men love and hate each other in a passion which defies description. Murder, suicide, starvation, insanity, icy death, and all the acts of the devil become regular mental pictures. The darkness, the cold, and isolation have very real and measurable effects on our minds and our bodies. On our bodies, in ways I had no idea about until researching this episode, and some part of us has always been aware of this. That's why we have deities of winter, monsters and demons that are said to come in the darkest nights of winter. Winter in the northern hemisphere is a time of dying, both literally and metaphorically. Plants, animals, and people die in the winter along with the previous year. Many winter solstice traditions were built for the purpose of keeping the group alive until the spring. Whether it by enforcing the making of clothes or effective harvest of foods, or even just appeasing some nasty deity so they might find it in their hearts to not eat our children in the night. Honestly, I say this all the time about the desert, so I have to be fair and say it here as well. Why did people ever think it was a good idea to live somewhere where the entire environment tries to kill you? People are weird, though. Many cultures have thrived for centuries in harsh, frozen environments, though. Native peoples in the Arctic have figured out how to make their lives comfortable despite everything around them being harsh and unforgiving. And it's not just human ingenuity and willpower that have made this possible. Genetically, some groups have adapted to be more comfortable in those places. And it's fucking awesome. Alright. I'm going to take a break real quick. Boom. Hello. Okay. So in order to understand why people go feral in the Arctic and Antarctic, we have to consider a lot of factors. I love factors. You know me. A factor collector. The common threads here seem to be the physical and social isolation, extended periods of darkness, and the bitter cold. So, I've done my best to understand how and why these three things affect us so strongly. The easiest to make sense of for me was the way that light, or lack thereof, fucks with us. Essentially, our exposure to light regulates our circadian rhythm, which you may know controls when, how long, and how deeply we sleep. It also affects all of the other functions in our body, though, including metabolism, and even the way our body processes medications. This gets entirely fucked up when we're really far north or really far south, because the days and nights are longer. At the actual poles, we get ourselves a 6-month day and a 6-month night, essentially. So that trips our body's ability to do really anything. It influences cholesterol levels, vitamin processing, how quickly we heal from injuries, our immune system. I could go on, but I got bored of typing the list. Cholesterol levels have been shown to be higher in winter, which is possibly correlated with having less vitamin D due to reduced sun exposure. Whether it's winter or summer also affects our genes, which was fascinating to me. 30% of the human genome expression changes depending on the season. In winter, less sunlight activates pro-inflammatory genes, which is likely our body's attempt to boost our immune system, which may explain why there are more cardiovascular-related deaths during the winter. When your whole body is out of whack, your brain gets out of whack too. Your brain is in your body. It's kind of all one thing, technically. They're pretty closely connected, is what I'm trying to say. Inflammation, lack of restful sleep, and high cholesterol will all have an influence on your mental state. Shit, I'm a huge asshole, even if my knee feels funny. Like, if I got a wonky knee that day, I'm a bitch. There's something mildly irritating the whole goddamn day through. You want to add to that? I think not a spoon that was too close to the edge of the counter. I'm gonna throw a fit. Learning about the effects of isolation, though. That one was really, really interesting. It's funny to think about because a lot of people intentionally opt out of socializing or opt for some form of isolation. We value our personal space and our personal peace. However, it's counterintuitive to want to die alone on a mountainside, considering how deeply rooted in our biological evolution family and community are. Humans could never have survived all this time without community, so what is it about current times that makes so many of us yearn for some level of isolation? Honestly, I blame the way that we're perpetually bombarded by demands from society and others that we get no real value out of. If my choices are A, get yelled at by some asshole to work my ass off every day and still never be able to afford to maintain and enjoy a safe home, or B, commandeer a hillside, dig a hole, and eat roots in the comfort of my weird cave. The cave is just very enticing, you know? But we need people on a very deep and evolutionary level. It would just be ideal if we cared about each other and weren't assholes so that we could hang out and get all that good health stuff from hanging out without being dicks to each other, essentially. or at least if we weren't actively assholes all the time. I think that would help and be better for everyone on a societal level as well as an individual level. So can we work on that? Can we work on not being pieces of shit? Thank you for your time. This isn't the case for everyone, obviously. Childhood, for most people, actually is, well, it's kind of oof when you really get down to it, but in a very general sense, we start our lives out in an enriched environment. As babies, we're taken care of by someone else. We're sleeping in a little spot, we have little toys to play with, and there's always someone around. Like I said, plenty of people aren't so lucky, but bear with me for the sake of making sense of a weird thing, okay? But then later in life, we end up in isolation, at least for periods of time. So our brains develop in enriched environments, which makes us less able to function when we are alone later. Humans are social animals, and so our physical and mental health are largely influenced by our interactions with others. That was a weird burp. Blah. Solitary confinement, for example, in the prison systems, has shown to just tear people apart psychologically. It's like one of the gnarliest torture techniques. Just isolate them. No matter how much of a strong-willed loner the prisoner is, solitary confinement breaks them down after a while. It's psychological torture, and can we please fucking not? While I'm on the subject, 80,000 people today are sitting in solitary confinement suffering. So, can we not? There's gotta be a better way, boys. Prison reform would be real fucking nice. About 150 square feet of space is required for basic standard maintenance of human mental health. In prison, people are allowed about half of that. So, before I get all riled up, we'll move on. But now you know my stance on that, if it wasn't obvious before. Anyway, rodents are extremely similar to humans in that way, which makes them helpful subjects when studying this. Rats are used to study the effects of social isolation, and the data gathered reflects the behaviors seen in humans put in comparable environments. The study of rodents examines the neural cells of the individuals once after 30 days. Wow, I did that backwards correctly, did I? Yeah, I did. I did it backwards correctly. God, I'm awesome. Okay, so the study examines the neural cells of individual rats once after 30 days of isolation, and then again after 90 days. Explaining the whole process of the experiment might get boring for both of us, so I'll keep it short. They take a cell sample from the brain, and they stain it with a sort of ink so they can look at it up close in a microscope and document the way the cells change in shape. After raising the rodents in an enriched environment, they're moved into isolation when they're mostly matured, basically when they're teenagers. 1 month of isolation hasn't shown to make any significant changes, but there was observed a 20% loss of volume in the neural cells in isolated male mice. Spine counts on the cells, like the pokeboys that stick out of the cells, the spine counts increase to make up the space left behind by that loss of volume. So within a month, the cells shrink down, but the spines on them stretch out to try to fill up the space. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. I'm bad at describing these things. And then after 90 days, there are significant changes in all parameters. Changes in the length of the dendrites, the long boys, further loss of cell volume, but by this time the spines have shrunk back down too. Because the spines aren't able to latch onto anything and form new connections with other cells, they basically give up due to lack of use, and rather than waste the energy by trying to reach further and further, they shrivel back down. And this suggests that about 3 months is the maximum length of time that a rodent can survive in isolation without lasting brain damage. Because it's inhumane to isolate the rodents any longer than this, we can't ethically test for what happens after even longer, especially not the years that some people spend in isolation. Isolation starting in adulthood reduces neurotrophin levels and cortisol levels, and it damages the DNA. I can't find any definite decisions about whether or not this is permanent or if it can be reversed if one is reintroduced to an enriched environment. Based on people that have been observed following extended periods of isolation, the changes can be mediated but are likely permanent. Essentially, extensive isolation leads to brain damage and even breaks down our bodies at a cellular level. Isn't that fucking crazy? The fucking mountain man Mike got no brain left. Poor guy. One major factor in how strongly isolation affects people seems to be boredom. You know, I keep trying to tell people that boredom physically hurts, but no. My mom always just tells me to do the dishes if I got nothing to do, and that's not what I mean, mother. But for real, boredom makes isolation significantly more torturous. Prisoners of war have testified that they've managed to not go crazy in isolation because of their sense of purpose, which helps to outweigh the boredom factor. It psychologically increases mechanisms that make us more resilient in situations of isolation and powerlessness if we have a mission, you know? Something that we're like, it's for this, it's my purpose. Just a little something that keeps you from going, you know what I'm saying? And on to cold. Cold is an interesting factor in this as well. But while negative effects of isolation start off in the brain, the cold changes the body. The cold is truly terrifying if you really think about it. We are #blessed to have so many methods of keeping warm, especially today. The oldest man-made building was a windbreak, built by Australopithecus 2.5 million years ago. That's how long we've been trying to avoid being cold. As a species, we just don't fucking like it. There are 2 different types of cold that kill: peripheral cooling and deep body cooling. Peripheral cooling causes physical incapacitation like frostbite, and deep body cooling is hypothermia, when your insides get cold. Cold water is the gnarliest of the things, as it causes cold shock, cardiac arrest, okay, I was going to say something else, but apparently I didn't type it down. Cold water is more viscous, which makes it harder to swim in. And people submerged in cold water end up using shorter, faster strokes as they slowly shift into a vertical position, making them more likely to sink and drown. Cold water is the leading cause of death among athletes because of the cold shock response. The cold water first causes shivering, then decreased muscle tendon elasticity, and lower mechanical efficiency. Basically, it makes your body stop working, no matter how strong you are. It decreases blood flow, requires more oxygen to keep your muscles working, taking oxygen from the brain to compensate, and then nerve blockage occurs when submerged in, 5 to 15 degrees Celsius for 1 to 15 minutes. Funny enough, I had just got done researching and typing out the notes for this section when I decided to take a break, and my boyfriend and I decided to watch something on TV, and we ended up watching an episode of something, Limitless? Something on Amazon, where the guy who plays Thor was, talking to people, and his whole thing he was going to jump in frozen water, so he was, training his body to handle the cold, so he could swim a certain distance or for a certain time through, ice cold water in the ocean. And I was, losing my shit, because this is exactly what I was just reading about for the last 3 hours. Whoa. That was a weird synchronicity. Moving on. Being in the cold more often makes you better at adjusting to it. If you're out in the cold often, you're better at being in the cold. Okay, that makes sense, right? Really, the only things that seem to factor into how well you handle the cold are your physique, adaptation, and in some cases, your genetics. Sadly, we can't, on an individual level, force a neuromuscular adaptation that makes us impervious to the cold. That would be cool as hell if we could, however. Even with repeated exposure and repeated swims in ice water, there's no verified change in manual dexterity. But in animals, you can see a shift in muscle density and muscle fiber. So it may induce a decrease in fiber size and increase the size of capillaries over time, but this isn't proven as of yet. During studies between two separate groups, it worked for one group and not the other, so we don't actually know. There's enormously confused literature on the subject because some ethnic groups have absolutely and observably adapted to the cold better, but we actually have no idea in what specific ways. Indigenous Siberian populations can help to date adaptation genes that will show us the strongest signals of positive selection, meaning by looking at their DNA, we can figure out which genes have been passed through generations which help to function better in the cold, if that makes sense. The genes we'd have to look at are those involved in energy regulation and metabolism and vascular smooth muscle contraction. So those are the three big ones that influence whether or not the cold straight fucks us. And while we can't practice our way into being magical ice water creatures, we are able to habituate our bodies to the cold through repeated exposure. Habituation is essentially short-term individual adaptation. The body gets familiar enough with a stimulus, if it's constant enough, that its response to that stimulus is decreased and less dramatic. Like increasing your alcohol tolerance. Same shit. You can reduce your cold shock response by about 40% with as few as 5 or 6 3-minute immersions in cold water, which is magnificent. Apparently, this habituation lasts about 14 months. This means that if you're ballsy enough to jump into ice-cold water a few times and chill there for a few minutes, you'll be way fucking better at it every other time you do it for the following 14 months. But after that, if you don't do it again, obviously if you only do it those 5 or 6 times and then never again for 14 months, the habituation dissipates and you're essentially back to square one on the whole, having a heart attack when you jump into freezing cold water thing. All of this explains how the cold kills us when we're exposed, but doesn't really show any psychological effects. I believe the way it affects our brains is kind of the same way that being in pain does. Like I mentioned earlier, how I'm an asshole if any part of my body hurts. Being under that level of physical stress tears away your focus on what you're supposed to be doing because you can't help but stay aware of how your ass is numb, for example. And of course you're not going to be the most friendly fucker at the party if you're in a lot of pain. I believe that the reason why people totally lose their shit when they're stuck in extreme environments like Antarctica is that there's this combination of all three things going on at once. Not only are you isolated physically in a small space with a bunch of assholes, but you're so far out of reach of anyone you love back home. And you know that at times it can be as long as 6 months until you can leave. And even that long until you can see sun again, you know? I've gone through tons of survival stories from people who got fucked over in the Arctic or on frozen mountaintops. And while they're all extremely interesting, some are way nastier than others. Like the Terror in the Arctic. And then there's the Greeley expedition, also in the Arctic. And I almost considered going into Dyatlov Pass. But I feel like almost everyone who talks about anything weird or the spooky or unsolved, I think they technically think they solved it now. But everyone's talked about Dyatlov Pass. I will, if you guys haven't heard it before or are interested in my take on the whole thing, I would be willing to go over Dyatlov Pass at some point. Because it is fucking interesting, and it was a hell of a mystery at first. But yeah, so that's why we go insane when we are in an Arctic environment. Because everything about the environment is trying to kill everything about you, mentally and physically. And that's terrifying, isn't it? Like, what are you gonna do about it? You cut open the asshole you're playing chess against and climb into him so you have 2 bodies worth of warmth so you can trudge out into the absolute darkness and go have a bad time like that? Come on. You're basically fucked. I didn't actually leave. I just didn't want to record myself while I took a giant swig of this Walmart brand strawberry seltzer water. It's delicious. It's almost like juice, but there's no sugar. It's great for you. Anyway. Also, it's good to have a stopping point for, like, segments. So, that's what you get. It's what you get. Anyway, back to it. Funny enough, while researching this subject, I accidentally found out that there are a whole lot of just out there conspiracy theories regarding the North and South Poles, especially Antarctica, which shouldn't have been so surprising to me, I suppose. I feel like I'm smarter than that, but, am I? Like, I don't even know where people come up with this shit. And I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Zombies at the Center of the Earth, but you should watch it if you haven't. Anyway, I thought that was jokes. I thought that movie was jokes. I didn't think that in the age of information in which we live, and are in fact fully immersed, people could actually believe this shit. Apparently, Antarctica is just a huge secret military facility, and also, obviously, there's a hole there that leads to a second Earth underground, and that's where robot Hitler lives with his mutant Nazi army. If you didn't know, now you do. Anyway, this is news to me. My friend and I actually put a whole lot of research into how to get to go work down there many years ago, like 12 years ago now. We called the plot The Great Escape. We're sick of this horrible world and wanted to go escape into the frozen wasteland of Antarctica. And almost anyone can go live and work down there at the station or one of the stations for 6 months. The scientists who are down there collecting data need cooking staff, janitorial staff, laborers, etc. You just have to have your wisdom teeth out, your appendix and tonsils out, and have, like, really good health stats, essentially. Because if anything medically unfortunate happens when you're down there, it's, like, really hard to get you the care you need. So they vet people based on that, essentially. At least that's how it was when we were looking into it. I'm too lazy to get things surgically removed from me, unless I absolutely have to, so I mostly scrapped my plot. However, there are a whole lot of people that live and work in Antarctica, and some of them even have TikToks that you can watch where they're walking around and being there, and it's not zombie Hitler stuff. I really don't think that funny video I saw of a penguin screaming and falling down a hill was doctored, or why anyone would do it. You know that penguins only live there, right? Antarctica exists because penguins exist. Penguins don't live anywhere else. Like, if you didn't know that, I don't know, maybe. Get it together, bros. I mean, it's ableist to say read a book, but whatever the non-dick way of expressing that sentiment, do that. That being said, those who live in Antarctica suffer the psychological effects of long-term exposure in that intensive an environment. Some people cope better than others with the darkness and the cold and the isolation. Antarctica, as you may expect, is the coldest, windiest, and driest area of the planet, with the highest altitude. People feel inclined to research it as thoroughly as possible because it's the part of the planet where it's best preserved and also the most prone to changes in the global environment and climate. So it's like crucial that we study Antarctica as it's changing rapidly so we can see the way environmental change is going to affect the rest of the world. It's because it's so drastically affected, it gives us big numbers to use, and more numbers, more better in science. The information that we gather from Antarctica is invaluable when it comes to natural history and data concerning the effects of climate change. It's basically its own natural laboratory for these areas of study. Unfortunately, is also sort of a laboratory for research on psychological effects of humans in severe situations. That's a side project that the continent has going on. That's its techno side project. Human madness. Major effects of this environment that have been repeatedly observed in people who live there are symptoms of depression, sleep disturbances, cognitive impairment, irritability leading to interpersonal conflict, withdrawal, like emotional withdrawal, and fatigue. These symptoms alone have been documented since the first studies performed in polar regions. The symptoms most often suffered are usually associated with stress and physical exhaustion, as well as a lack of environmental stimuli, a fancy way of saying violent boredom, and hormone levels that are related to the cold. Researchers have noted that these symptoms arise in a pattern associated with the seasons. As you may have expected, they are significantly amplified during the southern winter, where they experience 6 months of darkness. Although significant investments of both time and money have gone into improving the structure of the stations and the living environments for those at the South Pole, the psychological health of residents is still significantly affected. Mood and cognition problems are reported at very high rates, regardless of efforts to weaken the impact of the environment on the human beings living there. Many individual factors have to be considered with these observations because obviously no group of people is all going to respond the same way to the same stimuli or circumstances. There is yet to be a concise conclusion on what individual factors or personal characteristics make one more likely to go batshit crazy than someone else. Some possible factors that have been looked at are mental health going into it, physical issues that may cause extra stress or fatigue, hormone levels, stuff like that. Regardless of what causes these extreme psychological effects on an individual level, it is clear that climactic severity levels and duration of light and social isolation are challenges to humans' ability to adapt and perform. Like, no shit. I mean, like, if you think about it, that should be really obvious, but in situations like this where all of those things are happening at the same time for a long time, the way that it affects us is just, it's impressive. It's impressive. The first scientific expedition, set to be the first one into that unknown block of ice at the bottom of the world, was made by the Belgica. And 7 months after setting off. I already described this to you, didn't I? Yeah. But that was the first scientific mission. I don't know if I mentioned that at first. I know I said it was going to be the first mission, but it was the first scientific mission. And, I can't find any information out about this now, but I remember reading a story from Antarctica years ago that I found fascinating. I suppose it could have been fictional, or maybe some kind of urban legend. I'll tell you about it, but since I can't find it anywhere, don't accept that this is true just because I say it. Now you know better. You're a bunch of little smarty pantses. A bunch of little nerds. Yeah. Don't take my word as law. That would be silly. Anyway, the story went that a man stationed in Antarctica developed a severe alcohol problem, like you do. I didn't mention that, but alcohol and substance abuse are huge issues in Antarctica, which, if you think about it, checks out, considering the boredom and depression and the sleep issues. Anyway, this guy was a hell of a drunkard. He had to sort of hide his drinking because he kept getting in trouble for it, so he figured out how to mix certain chemicals available to him to drink and get a similar effect to that of knocking back the bruise. He was eventually found dead, and the cause of death was immediately accepted as accidental suicide by poison. Now that all makes sense and seems pretty cut and dry, if not incredibly sad. However, it later came to light that another individual on his crew had been in an ongoing conflict with this dude, and they'd been seen fighting and shouting and throwing shit at each other on multiple occasions. And then later on, the other dude was convicted for intentionally poisoning our alcoholic protagonist. I wish I could properly confirm or deny this story as true, because it was the first I had heard of crime in Antarctica, and it was fascinating to me. Luckily, there are provable examples of similar situations, which I will tell you about now. In May, the year of our Lord 2000, an Australian astrophysicist who was stationed at an American research station called Amundsen Scott South Pole Station died. His complaints the day before his death were nausea, fever, and stomach pains. It was generally agreed that he had died of natural causes, so he was placed into a freezer at the observatory. May is the beginning of the Antarctic winter, so he wasn't going to be able to be moved for 6 months. When the weather cleared up enough for him to be transported to New Zealand for an autopsy, it was concluded that he had died from methanol poisoning. How this happened is a mystery. An astrophysicist generally doesn't have to deal with a whole lot of methanol, and it's possible that he was intentionally poisoned. If someone done it, they done got away with it, because no one was ever convicted. And in 1959, at the Soviet research station called Vostok Station, 2 scientists got into a fight over a game of chess. Yeah, super intense game, that chess. When one of them lost, he got so pissed off that he straight up attacked the other dude with an ice axe. Some sources say he axed him to death and it was absolutely murder. Other sources say that the injuries weren't fatal. Either way, that gamer rage, am I right? After the KGB investigated, chess games were banned at all Russian stations. Personally, I don't think the game was the problem. But I'm not a Russian Fed, so what do I know? I am not a Russian Fed. Let that be clear. An interesting little side hole, that I started to fall down is the legal system in Antarctica. Law down there is complicated because the continent is kind of shared by every station. And, every nation has their stations. It's a station nation. You know what I mean. It would be fair to assume that if 2 Americans at an American station tried to murder each other, then they would be subject to the laws of the U.S. But because people from other stations are stationed in the stations of other countries, and technically the stations are not part of whatever country runs them because they're in Antarctica and not in that nation, shit gets weird. What if a Chilean hairdresser uses a dye that burns the scalp of a Russian scientist and it leads to severe injuries for the scientist? What if a drunk Australian engineer stabs an American cook at a Swedish research station? Since the continent has been primarily a scientific laboratory for most of the time people have even been there, focusing on crime and legalities didn't seem pertinent at first. There are no courts down there, no supranational tribunal empowered to resolve private disputes. Deciding which nation gets jurisdiction is a huge ordeal. In 1959, the Antarctic treaty system was set in place, so that helped a lot. That's helped a lot. Argentina, Australia, Chile, France, New Zealand, Norway, and the UK have established territory claims on the continent as well. So if something happens in their territory, they get to sort it out. But overall, it's the Wild West, dang it. Oh, dude, check this out. That one's for Kata. Anyway, that was the episode. I worked really hard on that, and I said hard on. I was really hoping to get that out to you guys last month, at least, but we do what we can here. We do what we can. So the episode with Holly of Morning Orange Tarot should be coming out relatively soon, and I've got some scribbly doodads for another one coming after that, and we'll see how it is. I have this fancy microphone now. I've got this nice webcam. I've got a computer that goes clicky clacky, so that's real exciting for me. And I haven't got a lot to do most days, so hopefully put some real work into stuff. Maybe figure out something to do with all this back here. Can you see Corn? Corn dog. Nah, he's sleeping. Anyway, that was that. Follow me on Twitch if you want to stare at my dumbass live and watch me have a bad time on Overwatch and get my feelings hurt because team chat is full of big meanie butthole faces. And that's about it. Once again, TikTok for personal updates on a regular basis. Join my Patreon. I have a few people on there, but I don't post much. I would post more if I felt like people cared about what I post on there more. Still waiting on my freaking life insurance license so I can start properly working. Luckily, I have a roof over my head and food in my belly, but money helps me live better, so I'll never say no to that. Oh yeah, and my TikTok is Alley Alchemy 9000, spelled Alley like in BackAlley Alchemist. So, anyway. Later, nerds.